So as some of you know, about 17 years ago, this storytelling phenomenon began to take shape. And there was a poet in New York named George Dawes Green, and he began to invite ordinary people to come into his living room and spend an evening talking about some particular topic: food, first love, the dark side, the roller coaster of life. And there was something about that revival of kind of this ancient tradition of telling a story, and in our media age, in the immediacy of it, and people gathering to listen to a story that just caught fire. And pretty soon, there were, in venues across New York City, there were these, what were called Moth story slams, of people coming together and doing this old-fashioned thing of spending an evening listening to a story. And then it began to go from city to city across the United States, and then in venues around the world, in Dublin, in Sydney, in London. And so some of us heard kind of in the background of our consciousness, perhaps, that there was this thing called the Moth. Fast forward, 2015. I was on a vacation with my wife, Yetta, my daughter, Sina, and we were in Napa Valley. We decided we would take in Berkeley. I'd never been to Berkeley. So here's the funkiness capital of the world. And so we took this expedition to Berkeley, and we went to Telegraph Avenue, and we saw the various spots, and we got a little bit of the flavor of it. We got the Amoeba Records and the Industrial Tattoo Parlor, and we saw the outside of it, but I just wasn't getting it. And I have a tendency to feel like an outsider when I travel anyhow. Fortunately, I have my lovely daughter, Sina, who understands that. And she knew I needed something to help me get inside what it meant to be in Berkeley, really get a feeling for this place, and not just kind of stroll around like a sightseer. And so she got us tickets to a Moth Story Slam at the Freight and Salvage Cafe. And as soon as I walked in there, I felt immediately like I was at home. It was almost like the Networker Symposium, about our age demographic in large part. But there was just this buzz about it, this sense like I was going to be invited into this community. I was going to get a feeling for what it was like to be a Berkeleyite. And so that evening, the theme was betrayal. And one after another, these storytellers came up on stage, and they told their raw, extremely personal stories. And all of a sudden, I felt like I was right there with each of them. I wanted to cry. I wanted some of them just to shut up. But I was just completely engaged in the whole process. Some I liked, some I didn't. But their stories, and over and over again, their stories rang a bell. And it really was so clear to me, if you really want to get inside a community, listen to the stories. And so we convened as a family, and we decided we needed to have a Moth evening at the Networker Symposium, and here we are tonight. So to Sina and to Yetta, our thanks to you for this evening. So here's what we have in store for you. We have asked 6 experienced master therapists to sort through the complicated file of their mind and to choose the most therapeutic moment that they have experienced. And we've kept that purposefully somewhat ambiguous to give the storytellers their freedom. And so what each of them is going to do tonight is take you inside that experience and to help us to feel what it was about that experience that took them out of the ordinary routine of being a therapist and somehow made that experience indelible, that made something extraordinary happen. So, and the ground rules of this evening are very simple. Each of of our storytellers is going to have 10 minutes to tell their story. And to make sure that they keep to that strict time limit, We have the networker's resident expert on deadlines, our managing editor, Livia Kent. Livia, come up. Let's give her a round of applause. The networker's secret weapon. And so she will let each storyteller know when there are a minute to go in their story and when they need to wrap it up. And that's it. And so I will introduce each of these storytellers. I will take my usual prolixity and condense it, and we'll have so each of them has given me a statement about what epitomizes their practice, and then we'll invite them up and we'll give them a rich round of applause. So to begin with, our first storyteller tonight is Courtney Armstrong, and she practices in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and her specialty is working with finding playful and creative ways to help trauma sufferers come back to a fuller enjoyment of life. Let's welcome Courtney Armstrong.
He swaggered in his usual flannel shirt and faded denim jeans, but today he was also wearing a smirk on his face as he looked down at my shoes and said, I see you're wearing new boots today. Is that what you do with the money from our sessions? Or do you think you're going to kick my butt with your psycho mumbo jumbo? Well, I was a little taken aback by Michael's unnerving comments, and yet I was used to getting this kind of challenge from him. He liked to spar with me and use sarcasm as a defense in our sessions. Graduate school had not prepared me for this, but growing up with two obnoxious brothers had. And I found the only way that you could soften this sneering is to be playful and give their razzing right back to them. So I put my hands on my hips, screwed up my courage, channeled my best Albert Ellis, and said, yeah, I know you're trying to test me to see if I know what I'm doing and if this therapy thing has been worth your while, so I've got a challenge for you today. He folded his arms across his chest and said, okay, lady, bring it on. Give me your best shot. Now, for all the arrogance emitting out of his 6'2" frame, Michael was actually a rather fragile 34-year-old man who struggled with agoraphobia, depression, alcoholism, and a terrifying fear of crossing bridges. Having a bridge phobia in our town, Chattanooga, Tennessee, is a big problem. After all, we're nicknamed Bridge City, and you can hardly go anywhere without crossing the lake or the meandering Tennessee River that winds its way right through the middle of our town. Having this bridge phobia further locked Michael into the prison of despair he had created in his home. He never admitted to a suicidal plan, but all the signs were there: hopelessness, isolation, depression, alcohol, and a firearm in his house. I knew we needed to get a breakthrough soon, or he'd give up on therapy, and worse, I feared he'd give up on himself. So I looked him straight in the eye, and I said encouragingly, I think you're ready to cross a bridge. I thought maybe we could go down to the park that's just a few miles from the office. There's a little wooden footbridge there that crosses the Chickamauga Creek. I figured maybe we could go over that, or we don't even have to go over it. Let's just go down there and see how you're feeling around it. That way you can see if what we're doing is working. I'll even meet you there in my kick-ass boots. He said, no, Miss Courtney, I don't need you to go down there and hold my hand. I can do it all by my little self. Well, although part of me wanted to slap that snarky smile off his face, I was delighted that he was even considering this challenge. Realizing that what was motivating him was the chance to prove me wrong, I winked at him and said, I know you can do it, but I bet you won't. He said, I bet I will. I'll go do it right after this session. I'll even take a picture of myself on my phone to prove it to you, Miss Smarty Pants. I said, I don't believe it. I bet you $50 you won't do it. Oh. I really hadn't planned on doing that. It just flew out of my mouth before I had a chance to think it through. But now I'd thrown the gauntlet, and it was too late to take it back. He said, you're serious. You'll give me $50 if I go do this today. Hiding behind what little pride I had left. I said, yeah, but I don't have to worry about it because you're so stubborn. I know you won't do it. He said, I bet I will. I'm going to go do it right now. I want my $50. And with that, he ran out of the session, jumped in his car, and drove over to the park. While he was gone, a mixture of excitement and dread churned in my stomach. On the one hand, I was excited that he was facing one of his fears. And on the other hand, a series of disastrous consequences flashed through my mind. I thought, gosh, what if he goes over there and has a panic attack or freaks out? Do I need to be over there to be on standby and support him? What if he does do it and I have to give him $50? Is he going to expect me to give him $50 every time he achieves a goal? Have I just set myself up to be manipulated by this guy? What kind of countertransference issue triggered this dumb idea? Do I need to go back to therapy? Just then, my phone vibrated, and I looked down, and there Michael had texted me a picture of himself on the other side of the bridge with his tongue sticking out. And the caption, "Never make a bet with a crazy person." I texted him and said, congratulations. And we still had some time left in the office, so I said, come on back. I'm going to give you your money. I figured it was worth $50 if this got us on a new productive track and boosted his confidence. So when he came back into the office, he was swaggering and grinning from ear to ear, but when he reached out to take the money, his hands were trembling and his face was flushed. And as he received it from me, he bowed his head and began to sob. I put my hand on his shoulder and I said, Michael, that was a big step. You did it, man. You really did it. Because I know. I can't believe you got me caught up in that. But I did this. I can do this. I said, yeah, we just had to find something more compelling than your fear to get you to take a risk. After that success, we decided to do some other sessions outside the office, and they got more and more interesting. There was the time that we drove downtown to cross the narrow Market Street Bridge that sits 70 feet high above the Tennessee River. Right before you cross the bridge, there's a stoplight. And as we were sitting at that stoplight, Michael's driving, and he starts to shake. I said, are you okay? And he said, yeah. And when he looked at me, I realized he wasn't panicking. He was laughing. He said, have you seen who's driving the car next to us? And when I looked over, no joke, there's a guy dressed up like Smokey the Bear, driving a yellow Volkswagen. You can't make this stuff up. We both got so tickled, and Michael's fits of giggles dissipated his panic as we were driving across the bridge with Smokey the Bear. He drove back and forth across it 3 or 4 more times, and he was so excited that he was actually overcoming this. Then in another session, we decided to meet at Starbucks so he could face his fear of going into crowded public places. Before we went in, he was pacing a little bit and doing this, and I said, are you all right? You want to just walk around a little more before we go in? He goes, no, I can do this. He goes, you're wearing your damn boots today. I guess I'm going to have to do it. And so then he starts to walk in, and then his panic gave way to snickering when at the counter we see a woman apparently wearing jeans 2 sizes too small, and half of her entire rear end is hanging out of her jeans, and she doesn't have the least bit of self-consciousness about it. I was so thrown off by the spectacle that I tripped over a chair and knocked over an entire box of straws on the counter. Michael just laughed and laughed. When we were leaving, he teased, I guess if that lady and you can go out in public without being embarrassed, I can too. Even though I had to cajole Michael into facing his fears, ironically, it was Michael who cajoled me into facing mine. Before I met with him, I was timid about confronting tough clients. I'd never done a session outside of the office, and I was afraid of taking therapeutic risks for fears that I'd offend the client or make a mistake. But this experience got me thinking, how many times do we hold ourselves back, thinking that therapy can only be done in the confines of our office as we maintain a reserved, composed presence? How many times do we think we've got to have all the answers, avoid making mistakes, or control all the feelings that are coming up for us in sessions? Now, granted, if I made a bet with all my clients or acted on every feeling that came up for me in a session, I'd be out of business. But these experiences with Michael taught me that sometimes clients benefit from seeing our vulnerability, our humanness, our tears, our fears, and most of all, our willingness to take risks and even make fools out of ourselves as we model how to deal with our own imperfections. Doing so can free our clients up to do the same and discover their courage to change and how to pick themselves up when things don't go as planned. After that, Michael began to get courage to overcome even more fears, and what really made a difference was when he got the courage to start going to 12-step meetings and entered a recovery program. He also worked diligently in our sessions to heal the pain of growing up with an aloof, alcoholic father, another source of his anxiety and depression. He even invited his father to a session, another bridge he'd long feared to cross because they hadn't spoken for years. His father was receptive, and beginning to work things out with his father was instrumental in his healing. Michael wrote me recently and told me that he was still crossing bridges, maintaining his sobriety, and he and his father were actually getting along pretty well. At the end of the letter, he told me, "You've got a strange way of doing therapy, but I just want you to know you helped me. In fact, you saved my life." I had no idea that making a bet that day would open a new door for me, Michael, and even his father. But I'm glad I took the risk and crossed that bridge. Thank you.
Courtney Armstrong. Our next storyteller is Ron Taffel. Ron practices in Manhattan, specializes in working with young adults and their families, and his particular angle of vision is understanding that often the issue that is most pressing is not something that's taking place within the family, but in the tensions of growing up in a culture that can be very difficult to grow up in. Ron Taffel.
Those of you who are well trained will be able to sense pretty quickly that I am not from Chattanooga. Nor is this story. Almost 15-year-old Jenny comes in with her family. She's having trouble in school. Her grades are tanking. But what they're really concerned about is that Jenny is starting to plan with her friends for New Year's Eve. Remember, she's 14 going on 15. Everybody in her second family of the peer group and pop culture, everybody knows all the details except none of the parents do. So the reason they're there is because these parents would like to get some information, and I would like to help them to create greater hierarchy in the family. So I get them to start talking, and they begin, and they try to start with basics like, what time does the party start? And Jenny is kind of like many kids we know, a junior litigator, a great obfuscator, a great thwarter, can hardly say the word, and she basically says, well, it's not really clear, it's a little bit later than what we want, but earlier than maybe what we think. And we won't know until we get there. So what it turns out to be is that the party starts at 12 midnight. I won't take you through all the details, but it ends at 4 in the morning. Remember how old she is. Parents, all of a sudden, you can start to see them get crazed and levitate, and they say, well, who's going to be there? Oh, there'll be lots and lots of kids. About how many? Well, it's hard to count when there are so many. Who knows? They're coming from all over. And it turns out there are 300 kids who are going to be at this party. will there be any adults there? No, of course not. That's the point, Mom and Dad. Don't you get it? 300 of us are going to be there. We're going to talk to each other. We're going to have a great time. There won't be any problems. And anyway, no adults live in a loft like that. This was a loft party. So they ask all of a sudden, listen, where is this party? Here's Jenny rises to the occasion and she says, well, in her most sphinx-like way, well, it's somewhere between here and there. Somewhere between here and the bottom. And they're saying, the bottom of what? It turns out the party is at Times Square and 42nd Street. All of a sudden, Mom and Dad are literally in unison screaming at her, Times Square, 12 to 4 a.m., 300 kids. Who's doing the supervision? Hookers? And she said, Mom, don't be ridiculous. Remember, I said there's no adults that are going to be there. They start fighting, literally. I mean, they're almost on each other, Mom and Jenny. They're going at each other. Dad is trying to break them apart. And I, because of all of the tremendously excellent training I got, said, gee, this doesn't seem to be going too well. Why don't we take a break? So I send them out to the waiting room. And I start thinking, like, this is unbelievable. There's no hierarchy at all. There's no limits. And it just makes no sense to me, except I realize I've heard this over and over again, and so many of us have. I remember the kid who came to me with his mother and said, in such a convincing way, listen, he's 11, 12 years old, listen, I should be allowed to play more video games than I now play. And she said, why? You already play 5 hours a day. And he said, no, what you don't understand is that the latest research shows that video games will, he's 11 or 12, will in fact increase my cognitive ability, and because I play Call of Duty and Doom, two of the most violent video games that exist, I will become more empathic. This really got me interested now. And more empathic? Yes, because I have to figure out online what the moves are that my opponents are going to be making. And I'm thinking, like, maybe we made a mistake with our kids. Maybe we should be letting them play more video games, too, especially the violent ones. And I realized, you know what, this is nonsense. I got to bring the parents back in. I start to talk to them and say, look, we have to establish, and Mom breaks in. Because part of what Jenny had said on her way out is she said, when they blew up, Mom had said, listen, I have to call another parent about this. And Jenny had said, right before they left, she'd said, if you do that, I will never, ever talk to you and confide in you again. So when Mom came back in with Dad, and I started on the hierarchy bit, she said to me, all of a sudden crying, she said, Ron, I don't want to hear this from you. I don't want to hear this because I will not take a chance and lose that connection with her, that she won't confide in me again. And Dad said, look, I would like more limits. I would like more boundaries. But the truth is that since she's been 13 years old, she hasn't really talked to me at all. She hasn't said a word to me about anything meaningful. It's like I've been benched all these years, and I don't want to take a chance either. And we went back and forth about it, and I realized that's where they were. And as they were leaving, I said to them, you know, truthfully, I'm not sure what we would do with our two kids either. I don't know how to handle this. It's such a conundrum. On the one hand, we all know, we've all heard of mothers and kids who've stepped up and who tried to do the right thing, and they've been completely excluded from the group. We hear about them all the time. When I was going through this session with them, that week, that month, I've heard of 2 kids who had suicided because they were excluded from the group. in a serious way. At the same time, if there were no boundaries, these kids end up in hospitals. Every month, every one of us who works with adolescents and young adults are even more in danger in many ways, ends up in a hospital with blood levels of 3 of alcohol, and many of them make it, but some of them don't. And we're implicated in this. We are implicated in the way I was with Jenny and with her parents into trying to help them make the right decision, because there were real consequences that happened. So I said to them, I don't know how I'm going to handle this. I wouldn't know how I would do it. They come back after New Year's Eve, and they say, we figured out a solution. Here's what the solution was. They allowed Jenny to go to the party. I have to remind you, she's 14 going on 15. They allowed her to go, but Mom did call up Jenny's best friend's mother, and they went together. Jenny and her best friend went down to the loft, but Dad went with them. Dad went with them and sat outside the loft until their curfew, which was 1 o'clock. They came down. He took them back home to a party at home, which was with friends and neighbors and family, and they had a really good time. I thought at first, this is just unbelievable. I can't believe they gave in like that. And then I thought about ourselves. I thought about ourselves as parents. And I remember exactly how we gave in also. We've gone to so many indie rock concerts. I go in my rock concert garb, which is to try to blend in. Looking the way I do, I have to wear a hoodie, sunglasses, and I have to wear those earmuffs, that you get at shooting ranges to block out the sound. But we go. Why? For the same reasons that they were doing it. Because the world had changed. It was at that moment that I realized, after a decade of watching this happening, of writing for The Networker, that the culture had changed, families had changed, and we were no longer ever going to be able to create hierarchy without parents thinking about losing the connection, about losing the attachment. That's what this says here, from attachment to creativity, the theme of this conference. The world had changed. It had gone through a wrinkle of time. In that moment, through me, in that session, I could see it. And with that, I said to them, what made you come up with this solution? And they said to me, as strange as this sounds, it was when you said, you know what? You don't know the answer to this, and you don't know how and what you would do with your kids. All of a sudden, you weren't just the expert, you were a person in the room. And at that moment, I realized I wasn't just watching something change with the family. I was feeling something different from them. This family wanted it all. They wanted it all from each other. They weren't going to stop unless they had authority, attachment, connection, time together. They wanted all of it. And now what I was hearing, these parents saying to me, is they wanted more and all of it from me. They wanted me to be a person in the room with them. And since that time, and long before that, that's been so much the core of what it is that the work has been about for me. But before I tell you about that, I just want to tell you what happened with Jenny. Jenny went on. She became better in school. Things were fine. She got through that year. Her mom, because this is what happens in therapy, right? You take that unexpected turn, and all of a sudden you're in a different place. Her mom started a parents' peer group. That group grew into a whole community. That community started a peer group and a partnership between school and home, which I actually helped them to put together. And Dad then said to me, at the time that this happened, he said, you know what? He said, when I took her back home, she talked to me. It was the first time she talked to me about her life in 3 years. And for the first time, I felt needed again. I felt relevant. I felt like we were connected. And so what I took away from that is something that I feel we all take away, which is that the culture is changing, the families are changing. They're never going to be comfortable with just this hierarchy. They're going to need that attachment as well. And they want it all from us. They want it all from us in that room. They want us to learn how to be a person in the room with them. And sometimes I wonder, are we really teaching that? Are we really learning that? And I think that's the work that we're all involved with, how to be a person in the room, even as we try to help them heal and because we want them to heal. Thank you.
Taffel. Our next storyteller this evening is Mary Jo Barrett. She practices in the Chicago area. And Mary Jo's specialty in her practice is how to help trauma survivors access, and their families access their deepest resources through creating a collaborative relationship within the consulting room. Let's welcome Mary Jo Barrett.
You know, they say you never forget your first. It's 1978, and I just graduated from social work school. I was going to be the perky Jane Addams. It was my very first job. I was the very first in-home therapist for the state of Illinois in child abuse and neglect cases. And my very first case were the Byfords. The Byfords lived in a Chicago bungalow. Now, most Chicago bungalows have really cute, neat, mowed grass with flower boxes. The Byfords' house reminded me more of a bunker. It was like nothing could live there. The grass was dirty and yellow and dying. And when you walked up, dust blew up in my face. The windows were greasy and smudged, and you couldn't see in their house. And when I was inside, I couldn't see out. The family that lived there was Robert, the father. He was a 6'4" Chicago cop who I believed had guns in every one of his pockets at all times. Robert had sexually abused Laura for years. She was 16 when I first came to the house. She was an adorable, really cute 16-year-old who wore these great bell bottoms, matching jewelry with her sweaters. Her makeup was not too much, but not too little. She had this great bob haircut that I used to look at and go, I wish I could get my hair to look like that. And to the opposite of that was her mother, Risa. Now, Risa was beaten weekly by Robert. As a matter of fact, the day I first met them, she still had broken ribs from when he beat her right before he went to jail. Risa sat in the corner in a barrel chair every week. I'm not sure I ever saw her legs. I used to think of her as a gray mouse. She squeaked when she talked. Her hair was not dirty, but it was unkempt. Her clothes were kind of gray. I could never tell what color the house dress she wore with the snaps were. And she wore gray sweats under her house dress. I could never figure that out either. And then there was Carl. Carl was the 14-year-old, and he kind of like reminded me of this little kitten He'd teach me the dance steps whenever I came. We'd always dance together. He wore tie-dye shirts that said Grateful Dead on them. And I remember one time, Robert said to me, I just had to beat the gayness out of him. On this particular day, when I went to the home, I was about to knock on the door. And just as I was about to, there was an unbelievable crash of breaking glass. And I heard thuds and things happening. And without even thinking, I impulsively ran into the house. And there was the family. Laura, the daughter, had in her hand another glass she had just picked up, poised back like she was a quarterback on a football team. And there was Risa, sitting in her chair, looking up at her daughter saying, please don't hit me. Please don't hit me. And Carl was like a little cub going back and forth in a cage, saying, stop it, stop it. The minute I walked in, Laura heard me and she turned on her heel with her arms still back like that. I thought, oh my, she's going to throw it at me. She looked at me and she said, I hate you. I hate you. You were supposed to take care of me. He's getting out of jail. He's coming home. I hate you. I stood frozen. I have no idea how long I stood there. I went blank. And then I fell back into the couch, this couch that I had avoided for weeks because it had smelled like cat piss. And I was sure that it was going to swallow me up alive. And then I hoped it swallowed me up. I fell into the couch and sat there, hearing these voices inside my head, going, I don't know what to do. I have no idea what to do. I don't know how to help these people. I don't have any strength. I don't have any skills. I have no idea what to do. Something brought me out of this place, and I looked in front of me, and on the floor, Laura had fallen amongst the glass and was looking at me and said, Mary Jo, help me. Mary Jo, help me. I then started looking around the room. I don't know if I was looking for an escape out or I was looking for an answer. And I looked around and I thought, the only answer I have is sitting right in front of me in this room. My eyes caught Risa's. She was looking at me. I was looking at her. And I thought to myself, she's got to help me. I said, Risa, how can I help you? How can I help you with your family? What do you need? Tell me what you need. And it was like, whatever happened to me happened to her. We had this exchange. And Risa stood up for the first time I had ever seen her stand up. She walked over to her children. She got down on the floor, put her arms around them, touched their backs, played with their hair, and looked me straight in the eyes and said, Mary Jo, help me keep them safe. Help me take care of my children. In that moment, I knew something happened. I knew something had happened, but I didn't know what I knew. I didn't know what I knew. I just knew. There became more and more moments like that with the Byfords. I saw them for over 4.5 years. I began to call them Byford moments. One Byford moment was one day I came to the house. There was no crashing glass. There was no explosion. They were sitting in complete resignation, sitting there in this dark room. And the kids looked at me and said, are we ever going to have fun in our lives? Is this ever going to go away? I thought to myself, I don't know. I looked at him and said, I don't know. What do you think? What would be fun? What would be fun? Carl said, bowling would be fun. I was like, go no further. This is right up my alley. Little known fact, I wanted to be a professional bowler. It's true. And my mother said, no, Jewish girls do not become professional bowlers. But I thought to myself, a Jewish social worker could take a family bowling. So I turned to Risa again, and I said, Risa, if you figure out where we can go bowling, if you can figure it out, let me know, and I'll meet you at the alley next week. Next visit was in the bowling alley. And I walked out of that bowling alley thinking, I have no idea. I know we just had fun, but I don't know. I knew something had happened in the bowling alley, but I didn't know what. Another time, I went to visit Robert in his motorhome. When Robert got out of jail, he had a supervision order. You know about those. He had a supervision order that said you can only be 300 yards close to anybody in your family. He bought a motorhome and parked it 300 yards from the family bungalow. I was making a home visit to his motorhome, and I walked in, and there he sat, incredibly despondent. I said, Robert, what's going on? He said, I don't think I have it in me anymore. I don't think I can ever be a decent person. I said, Robert, I don't know. I don't know if you can be a decent person. What do you think a good person is? What's the ingredients for a decent person? What do you think? And we started talking about what it would take for him to be what he considered a decent man. A few weeks later, we did a home visit, and he told his family, this is what I think is a decent person. What do you think? I had Byford moments with hundreds of families for the next 20 or so years, even to the point where we started doing follow-up interviews, and I asked family after family after family, what were those moments that you knew something was happening? And one day during the interviews, I got an idea. It was 2002, 24 years after I had gone to that home that day. And I said, maybe we can find the Byfords. Internet. 3 weeks later, the Byfords were in my office, waiting to be interviewed. I walked up to the door, about to go in, and all of a sudden I heard a bunch of chairs moving around and people talking loud, and I went, shit. I walked in, and there they were. There they were. On my love seat was Risa. She had on a really cute yoga outfit with a yoga mat rolled up. She didn't have to worry about me doing that with her. And then next to her was Robert in a pinstripe shirt and khakis. On the couch was Carl, holding hands with his boyfriend, looking like J. Crew models. Next to Carl was Laura, and next to her was her 11-year-old daughter. They had just come from the school where Laura was a teacher, and she still had that really cute bob that I wished I could look like. I looked at them, I fell back into my chair. I said, look at you, just look at you. God, did you have any idea that 24 years ago I had no idea what I was doing? And they went, yeah, it was obvious. And I said, do you remember that day when Laura broke the glass? Do you remember that day? I think about that day every day. With so many of my families, I think about that day. Do you remember that day? They shook their head. I looked at Risa. Our eyes caught again. I said, Risa, what do you remember of that day? What was the meaning of that day to you? She looked at me and she said, that day? That was the first day that anybody had any faith in us. And at that moment, I knew what I hadn't known. Thank you. Thank you. I make you proud, buddy.
Yes. Mary Jo Barrett. Our next storyteller is Margie Nichols. Margie practices in New Jersey. She's a psychologist and a sex therapist. She works with the LGBTQ community. Margie, come up.
In 2004, I lost my daughter Jessie 4 days before her 10th birthday. She was in the hospital for months. There were a series of medical catastrophes following a brain surgery, culminating in a medication-induced illness called Stevens-Johnson syndrome. She died a terrible death. She spent the last 3 weeks of her life in the Cornell burn unit in a chemically induced coma. As you might imagine, I was in the worst shape of my life. Every morning I woke up and it was like, I can't believe I'm still alive. I can't believe I have to drag myself through another day. And every day the answer was the same. Yes, you got to do it. Among other things, the most important reason was I had a 20-year-old son. I had a second child who'd been devastated by the death of his baby sister and who obviously clearly needed his mom. So I wasn't able to commit suicide. Instead, I went into therapy. Now, I'm not the easiest person to fit with a therapist, and not just because I am a therapist. That's always a reason. I'm a cliche of my baby boomer generation. I'm a queer woman. I'm a lefty, liberal, atheist, hippie, peacenik type. The logical choice for me probably would have been a feminist therapist, a gay woman, a gay man. Instead, I found myself drawn to a guy who had trained me 15 years earlier, who was in many ways my he was a cliche of the other side of the baby boomer generation. The therapist I picked, Bruce, was Midwestern, straight, white guy, conservative, Republican, ex-seminarian, ex-Marine. Right, I know. That was my therapist. But the reason that so let me give you a sense of what Bruce is like. He's tall, he's thin, he's almost gaunt. He's not just white, he's pale. So he's almost ghostly looking, very severe. He doesn't come across cold, but he's certainly not a warm, fuzzy type, right? He's a rationalist, a realist. He's calm, he's considered, he's measured, right? Sort of like that. And that was part of what appealed to me. He doesn't have a sentimental bone in his body, and I was in no mood for sentimentality. What I needed was to be able to go into a therapist week after week, year after year, and say, still want to die, and have the therapist be able to say, okay, I got it. I understand. Now, it helped that I knew something about Bruce's background. I knew that he was a recovering alcoholic. I knew that he was a Vietnam vet. And so I felt very strongly that that one thing that we had in common was that we understood trauma, that both of us, as they say, had seen things that human beings shouldn't have to see. I knew that Bruce had a dark side. And that was really important to me because I was in a really, really dark place for a really, really long time. My spirituality was not a particular comfort to me. I have what I call a no-frills spirituality. I don't believe in a personal God. I don't believe in an afterlife. And I don't believe in a soul that exists after the body dies. So it wasn't like I was thinking, oh, someday I'll see Jessie again. For me, it's like, this is it, and then you die. And during that period of time, this is it, was pure pain. Almost every day I felt living is not worth the energy that it's taking me to drag myself through the day. And so week after week, year after year, I would go in and to see Bruce, and I would wail and scream and yell and beat my chair and just wail at the top of my lungs. I cried so much that I would go in, and Bruce always had a box of tissues and a waste paper basket right next to my chair. Now, I would cry forever, and during that time, he pretty much did nothing. He never touched me, he never tried to hug me, he never tried to comfort me. And that was really an important thing for me. It's hard to understand, but it was a really important thing. But every once in a while, I would look up when I was done crying, and I would see tears standing in his eyes. And that was really the most comfort I needed. I have a terrific support system. I was not looking for warm, fuzzy. That's not what I needed in therapy. I needed to be able to express my dark side. I would go in and I would say things like, Bruce, I'm never going to be happy again. And he would say, maybe not. I would say, Bruce, there's part of me that has died and is never going to come alive again. And he would say, that sounds about right, actually, for what you've been through. I would say, Bruce, life fucking sucks. And he'd say, I know what you mean. The Bible is right. Life is a vale of tears. And that was helpful to me. I also was very angry, and he was able to join me in my anger as well. I would rage about everything, big, little, and in between. One of my pet peeves was people who say, everything happens for a reason. Now, nobody had the nerve to say that to me to my face or to say it about my daughter's death. But, you can't help but hear it. People say it all the time. And it would always drive me crazy. I'm sure you know what I mean. It would be like, well, 3 months ago you lost your job, but now you got another one and it's even better. Everything happens for a reason. And I would be there like, you fucking kidding me? Seriously? You're going to tell me my daughter died for a reason? And I would go in and Bruce would really be able to join me in that. I remember one session I went in and I said, Bruce, the next person that says everything happens for a reason, I am going to put my hands around their neck and I am going to throttle them until they're dead, and you're going to have to bail me out of jail. His response, not only will I bail you out of jail, I'll defend you on the grounds of justifiable homicide. So the most significant session that Bruce and I ever had happened about 8 months after my daughter died. Unbeknownst to me, my son, who was away at college, was really much more devastated than even I had realized, and he'd gotten involved in some very self-destructive behavior. One night I got one of those middle-of-the-night phone calls that parents dread. I'm not going to give you details because I don't want to intrude on his privacy, but just let me say that there was a period of time that it looked very realistic that I might lose both of my children. During that time, I went in to see Bruce, and I said to him in a session, Bruce, I've thought this through. If Corey dies, I'm checking out. I'm not doing this a second time. And then I proceeded to tell him that I was going to buy a gun, the details of the plan. I had everything very clearly thought out. Now, if you're a therapist, it's never a fun time to have a client across from you saying they're going to kill themselves. Bruce's response was remarkable. He didn't call 911. He didn't try to talk me into checking into a psych ward. He didn't even make me make one of those contracts that therapists do about staying alive. What he did was he said to me, if your son dies, I really understand why you would kill yourself. I'll be really sad, but I absolutely understand it. At that moment, Bruce was not a therapist and I was not a client. We were meeting each other as two human beings, connected, understanding that there is some pain in life that human beings perhaps shouldn't be expected to bear. And that was a moment that really crystallized everything that was important to me about therapy with Bruce. The story has a happy ending. It's 12 years after my daughter has died. My son is fine. He's getting a PhD from Princeton in a couple of months, which he won't be able to do anything with, but still, he's happy. He's having a great time. And I went on a couple of years later to adopt two older girls from a Guatemalan orphanage. They had a whole history of abuse and neglect, and so every day the three of us heal each other. We heal each other. It is true that I'm never going to be as happy as I was when Jesse was alive, and it is true that there is part of me that has died and is never coming back again. But that's not the entire story. I once heard a parent who had lost a child describe their life this way. It's as if the backdrop of my life is painted blue. And that's kind of how I feel, that the backdrop of my life is painted blue. But the foreground these days isn't so bad. And to a large degree, I owe a lot of that to Bruce. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Our next storyteller is Hedy Schleifer. She practices right here in the D.C. area, and her work is about guiding couples to their fullest aliveness and to achieving the deepest encounter that they can. Hedy? Let's hear it for her.
So this time I went to meet the couple in their home for my 2-day couples intensive. The husband has multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is an illness that eats away at the protective cover of the brain. It slowly and gradually takes away your control over the movement of your body. First using a cane, then walking with a walker, then a scooter, and finally confined to a wheelchair, motorized wheelchair. The couple that I'm seeing is in their mid-50s, married 27 years. 20 of those years, multiple sclerosis has been in their midst. I meet them for the first time, he in his wheelchair, pale, gaunt, gray eyes, inward, she, bouncy, vivacious, vigilant. Intuitively, I choose a corner of their living room where there is a light and a plant. And we sit down, and I sit across from them, and I feel the tension in the room. Let's shut that light off. I hate that light. His eyes get sad. It turns out that he has helped this plant grow from two scraggly leaves to this flourishing bush with great care. I wish you gave me the attention that you give this plant. And I'm seeing the contours of their disconnection. I find out that the seed of this disconnection was already there from the very beginning. Before they were married, they went on a trip to Italy and to France. And she suggested, let's write journals. And they did. 2 years later, they are now married. They're in bed, and she says, let's read our journals. She, riddled with angst, pages and pages. Is he going to love me? He hasn't talked to me. Does he find me pretty? Should I marry him? Does he like me? Do I like him? I don't know. He, the Vatican, huge. Here is the seed of the dance of disconnection. A woman riddled with angst, with many, many, many words. A man closed off, monosyllabical. And here's where I start my work. And as I always do, I ask a question. What is your wildest dream for your relationship? And he begins and he says, shared physical pleasure. And just as he says it, tears well up. Deep, deep regret when I could do it, when I simply could reach out, when I simply could hug her. I didn't think about it. And an ocean of tears begins to come. And he's crying, and he's crying. But suddenly he gives himself permission to feel this pleasure. He closes his eyes and he lets himself go into what it is like to have physical pleasure. And as he does, his face relaxes. He looks radiant. He actually looks handsome. And just as he does, suddenly, his body freezes. His eyes narrow. His hands tremble. He's gripped by fear, hijacked by dread. I say to him, "Who just showed up?" And together we name this part of him. It's the scared, uptight, silent boy. "Oh, I know this boy," he says. "He's been with me forever." I want to say to this boy, "It's okay. Don't get panicky." And I want to say to myself, "It's okay. You can have pleasure." When I had it, when I felt it there, I felt calm, I felt self-assured, I felt whole. And when I am that way, everything is possible with my wife. I say to him, "What's the image you have of this physical pleasure?" And he blushes. And so I say, "Whisper it in her ear." And he does. And his mouth to her ear, he whispers what he does, and she blushes. And they chuckle together cozily, and their eyes meet in a moment of sweet intimacy. And it's her turn. And before she can articulate a dream, she's hijacked. I can see her body is stiff and her face is sour and angry. And I say, "Who just showed up?" She says, "I know her. I know this sour-faced, angry lady. I call her Matilda the Martyr." And as she talks to me about Matilda, I can actually see the myriads of efforts of the caretaker to someone who's hampered in their body, the small and the big things you have to do on a daily basis, water, medication, flex balls for the hurting neck, the complicated bowel movements, more and more complex. And their story emerges, and I tell it to them. Once upon a time, a vibrant, passionate young woman had a soulful, deep young man. The seed, unbeknownst to them, the seed of their disconnection was already there between them, right there from the very beginning. 27 years later, with multiple sclerosis in the picture, now the seed has become a disconnecting survival dance. It's as if it's not a relationship between them anymore. They are being hijacked by Matilda, the martyr, and the scared, uptight, silent boy. And the more Matilda is hostage, the more she is hostage to Matilda, the more he is hostage to the boy, the more he's hostage to the boy, the more she is hostage to Matilda. And she says, "I know what I want. I want the multiple sclerosis to go away." And he says, "Yes, the multiple sclerosis is an uninvited guest. He is an intruder in our life, and he won't go away." And suddenly their eyes meet in complicity. They hadn't seen that they're both hosts together to this uninvited guest. And her hand reaches to his knee. And as they look at each other, they understand for the first time about we together are hosting. Let's meet here where the lamp and the plant are whenever we feel sad or helpless or hopeless, when the difficulties overwhelm us. Let's meet here and be together. I know personally about how this kind of unity helps us with the uninvited guests in our life. 21 years ago, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And my husband Yumi held my hand in a way I didn't even know a hand could be held. He said to me, you know, we're going to name this adventure. And he named it Rallying Around the Boob. And everybody that rallied, we called them the Boob Brigade. And we had an international Boob Brigade. And years later, depression knocked at Yumi's door. And I decided I am marrying this man, this fragile man at the edge of life and death. And so when he was in the hospital, I got into bed with him. And the nurse never knew, who's the patient here? 2 heads under the blanket. And a young woman who was in the unit there said, are you guys not married? It's the power of connection, I feel, that helps us to welcome and honor the uninvited guests in our life. And so after 2 days of journeying with this couple, after many magical moments of connection, she said, you know, today the multiple sclerosis was gone. It was so liberating. I just didn't feel it. And he said, our connection today was an act of transcendence. She looked at him and said, you're my brave man. And he looked at her and said, you're the one who brought me here. Martin Buber, the philosopher, has a good way of describing this. What he says is this: when 2 people meet authentically, God is the electricity that surges between them.
Hedy Schleifer. Our last storyteller this evening is Terry Reel. Terry is in the Boston area, and his specialty is working with couples and helping them keep passion alive by guiding them to tell the truth lovingly to each other while he tells the truth with compassion to the 2 of them. Terry.
I call this story of resilience, of rising to the occasion, the found and the lost. When Sylvie first entered my office with Ben, her husband, the word that came to mind, and I mean this with all due respect, was schlub. While Sylvie was svelte and stylish, Ben was a mess. 6'2", well over 60 pounds overweight. His baggy chinos hung from his hips, so low that you were afraid they were going to fall off. He had his shirt half in and out. He had his glasses held together by a paper clip. I'll tell you, if they're still selling pocket protectors, Ben would be first in line. And indeed, schlub was the presenting problem. Sylvie was bored with her marriage. She told me that when they were first together, Ben would pour out a poet's soul to her, love poems, long talks, lots of questions. But those days were long gone. Nowadays, when Ben came home, he popped open a beer, plopped in front of the TV set, and affably gave not much. He was close to his 3 daughters, particularly the youngest one, Carrie, but even Ben would say he was more playmate than father. Over time, as Ben grew more comfortable and passive, Sylvie grew more dissatisfied and sharp. She was difficult, and he was shapeless. She was a mosquito stabbing at dough. I listened to the 2 of them, and I have to confess, after a while, I agreed with Sylvie. Look, I'm not a neutral therapist. When called for, I take sides. Ben was the kind of guy who gave all the way up to the altar and then crapped out. Sorry, that's enough. He was a big baby in many ways who expected to be doted on by Sylvie in the same way he had been by his loving mother in childhood. Or at the very least, he expected to be left alone the way his family had distanced from his difficult father. When I told Ben that Sylvie was right, that he let himself go in all sorts of ways, at first he collapsed into a pool of shame, and I had to prop him up emotionally. But eventually he digested the difficult news, and together we embarked on an explicit makeover. Ben went on a diet. I hooked him up with a personal trainer. He took himself off to Newbury Street in Boston, got new shoes, new clothes, a new hairdo, the works. But it was more than his physical appearance, obviously. Ben needed to render himself more pleasing to his wife in all sorts of ways, particularly emotionally. He needed to come out of his passivity and his shell and engage. I'm doing this for love, he told me in one session later on. You're just doing what all good husbands do, I said back to him. You have to effort yourself. You have to give. I handed Ben a dog-eared copy of a book, 50 Romantic Things to Do with Your Wife. And he said he had a good time with his daughter Carrie, going over it and trying to find the perfect romantic gesture, until Carrie got fed up with her father's indecision and said, just buy her some damn flowers, Dad. To her credit, Sylvie did not disqualify or criticize her husband's nascent attempts at closeness. She loved him. She had 3 kids by him. She wanted him to succeed. Besides, Sylvie came from good old Yankee stock, and she carried many of the best traits of that tribe. She was decent to the bone. She was a good person. Which is why I'm telling you the story. It was Sylvie's goodness that drove her out of her car one snowy winter New England night. The car in front of her had skid on a patch of ice and landed on a ditch on the side of the road. Sylvie and Carrie went out to lend a hand. It was then that a second car hit that same patch of ice, lost control, and careened into the first car. Careened into Sylvie and Carrie. Sylvie had multiple fractures in both legs and one arm. Carrie was dead within minutes. By the time Ben called me, Sylvie had been in the hospital that night and the better part of the next day. She was on high dose of morphine, and between the drugs and the shock, she was pretty much out of her mind. She kept calling for her daughter. Where is she? She said. Where is she? And no matter who, no matter how many times, she simply refused to take in that Carrie was gone. She would turn her head, she would change the subject, she would act as if the person literally wasn't speaking. Ben called me, frantic, barely able to speak. You've got to help her, he said. I can't bear to see her this way. She'll listen to you, Terry. She always listens to you. The profusion of gifts and flowers in Sylvie's room had the opposite effect of cheering me. It looked like a funeral parlor. I was also unprepared for the sight of her. Swollen face beyond recognition, tubes all over her, 3 limbs in traction. I sat next to Ben and took Sylvie's good hand. Sylvie, I said, something terrible has happened. We went through it. 5, 10, it was interminable. I felt cruel. I felt sadistic. Finally, we connected. Her eyes grew wild. She turned her head and sobbed. heart-wrenching, raw. I don't know if I served her in those moments. I don't know if it would have been better to leave her in peace. But then again, she hadn't really been in peace, had she? She dried her eyes, she blew her nose, she turned to her husband, and she said something that has haunted me for the rest of my life. She told Ben to go home and fetch Carrie's old fisherman's sweater. Then she turned to me. "You've got to promise me," she said. "You've got to promise me that you'll get this to her. She'll need it. She's cold. She's dead." Carrie was buried in that sweater 3 days later. It felt like half the town had come out for her. Kids spilling out the steps into the streets. I stood close to the family. Sylvie propped up in a hospital bed, Ben beside her holding her hand, stiff and handsome in his new suit. I visited the family as best I could over the next 6 months or so. About 3 months into it, Ben confessed that all along he'd been keeping a blog, that he had poured out his grief and anguish onto the internet. And his words were so clear, so simple, and from the heart, that he had actually gathered thousands of followers from around the world. I want to recite for you a few words from an early blog, a blog he called Holding My Breath. Here's Ben. "People ask me if I miss her. Actually, I don't. Maybe I'm in some kind of denial or shock, but I actually feel close to her. I see her in the sky. I see her in the clouds. I feel her now as I write these words. I don't miss her. I miss us. I miss the back and forth, the teasing, which she called talking smack. Everything froze. The minute they told me, everything stopped. I haven't had a full breath since that moment. I have hovered since then between here and God knows where. You see, I'm the ghost. I don't want to start breathing. If I did, if I began to live again, it would mean the whole world would be going on without her. And that's simply unthinkable. I can't imagine accepting that. There can be no world without Carrie, laughing and alive. It was just a matter of time until someone told Sylvie about Ben's blog. She told me she went back and read every entry. It was amazing, she said. Here was my poet's heart. Here was the man I loved. I fell for him, she said, all over again. But of course, it wasn't just his blog. It was Ben. It was the way he showed up for his own complex feelings. It was the way he showed up for his wife. It was the way he showed up. 6 months after the accident, I was sitting in Sylvie's bedroom, the three of us, locked in what seemed like a dark, heavy, interminable silence. All three of us, I believe, thinking what Sylvie finally put into words. I lost my daughter, she said, and I found my husband. You hear that the greatest predictor of divorce is the death of a child. You hear that there is no force on earth more capable of ripping apart a loving union. Not always. Thank you.
What a night. What a range of experiences. And I don't know, for me, it's an experience of listening to these colleagues and feeling such pride in that there are people of this sensitivity and this stature doing our work, and that this room is filled with it. Let's invite them up to the stage, storytellers, and let's give them a big round of applause. Come on up. So go home, think about what your most memorable therapeutic moments are, and maybe we'll meet together next year, same time, and hear about your experience. Tonight's it's been a wonderful night, and the adventure isn't over. The dance is right across the way, so if you have some energy, some spirit, just go on and dance yourself into the night. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.